The Syrian Civil War erupted following widespread demonstrations that began in March 2011, initially sparked by calls for political reforms in Daraa and later spreading across Syria. The conflict escalated into a multifaceted war involving various internal and external actors. While some argue that the conflict could have been averted through substantial reforms by the Assad regime, others contend that the regime's entrenched authoritarianism and historical behavior made the war almost inevitable. Foreign support to opposition groups further complicated the situation, transforming the conflict into a proxy war. As the conflict unfolded, it became clear that the term civil war only partially captured its complexity. The Assad regime, backed by Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah, faced off against a diverse array of opposition forces, including defected Syrian military personnel and foreign fighters. The devastating toll of the war included hundreds of thousands of casualties and millions displaced, both internally and externally. The dynamics of sectarianism also played a significant role, with the Alawi-dominated regime facing opposition from various religious and ethnic groups. While initial demands for change were largely peaceful and democratic, the regime's brutal crackdown and subsequent violence exacerbated sectarian tensions. Efforts to achieve a peaceful resolution or implement meaningful reforms proved elusive. The regime's reluctance to cede power and the opposition's demands for justice and freedom contributed to a protracted conflict. Despite some opportunities for negotiation, the war persisted, leading to further suffering and instability. The Syrian Civil War underscores the complexity and brutality of modern conflicts, where entrenched regimes, external interventions, sectarian divisions, and grassroots movements intersect in a deadly struggle for power and survival. In the early stages of the Syrian Revolution, before the conflict reached its devastating peak, there was a glimmer of hope for a peaceful resolution through national dialogue and reconciliation. In June 2011, internal opposition figures gathered in Damascus to discuss potential solutions to the crisis. Among them were well-known activists who had endured years of imprisonment under the regime's rule. Their vision was clear: a transition to a democratic, civil, and pluralistic state, marked by an end to the brutal security crackdown and the withdrawal of military forces. They emphasized the necessity of confidence-building measures, such as an independent investigation into civilian and soldier deaths, the release of political prisoners, and the right to peaceful protest without government interference. Despite the unprecedented nature of these opposition meetings, they did not lead to meaningful dialogue with the regime. In July 2011, the regime organized its own gathering, primarily attended by loyalists and a handful of opposition representatives with closer ties to the government. However, these efforts also fell short of fostering genuine dialogue. The rift between the regime and the opposition ran deep, rooted in mutual distrust. Both sides seemed unwilling to engage in meaningful negotiations without certain preconditions being met. The lack of trust proved to be an insurmountable barrier to achieving real reconciliation. Even the establishment of a Ministry of Reconciliation later in the year failed to bridge this gap, with President Bashar al-Assad reportedly viewing it as nothing more than a war cabinet, reflecting his true intentions. The regime's initial approach, relying solely on brute force to suppress dissent, mirrored past tactics employed in places like Hama in 1982. However, this time, the circumstances were vastly different. The Syrian people, emboldened by a newfound sense of courage and solidarity, refused to be silenced. They received support, both politically and militarily, from abroad, altering the dynamics of the conflict irreversibly. The regime's reliance on repression alone proved to be a disastrous miscalculation in the face of a populace determined to fight for change. As the Syrian conflict unfolded, several countries and organizations initially attempted to facilitate a peaceful resolution and intra-Syrian dialogue. Efforts from countries like Turkey and Saudi Arabia, as well as organizations like the Arab League, aimed at mediating and encouraging reform measures, but unfortunately, they yielded little success. The ongoing violence perpetrated by the regime, coupled with the failure of mediation attempts, prompted these actors to shift their support towards the opposition, providing funds, weapons, and other forms of aid. Turkey played a pivotal role by allowing aid and weaponry to flow into Syria through its borders, particularly after opposition forces gained control of key border crossings. While most countries claimed to support a political solution, Turkey openly called for the regime's overthrow, signaling a divergence in approaches. The involvement of external actors gradually transformed the conflict into a proxy war, further complicating the already dire situation. The Arab League's decision to freeze Syria's membership only exacerbated tensions, deepening the divide between Syria and other Arab states. Despite efforts to engage the opposition, the Arab League stopped short of granting official recognition, fueling frustration and distrust. On the international stage, Western countries' decision to label President Assad and his regime as illegitimate hindered any possibility of dialogue. Diplomatic relations deteriorated further as ambassadors were withdrawn from Damascus, cutting off crucial channels of communication and intelligence gathering. Sanctions imposed by the United States, the European Union, and other nations failed to achieve their intended goals, instead exacerbating the suffering of the population without weakening the regime's resolve. The idea of imposing targeted sanctions to pressure the regime while sparing civilians proved to be wishful thinking. As historical precedent suggested, dictators like Assad, immune to democratic norms, were unlikely to yield to external pressure, despite hopes that mounting pressure would compel Assad to step down or seek a resolution. The regime's resilience only underscored the limitations of sanctions as a means of regime change. In the complex landscape of the Syrian conflict, diplomatic efforts faltered, and external interventions often exacerbated tensions, prolonging the suffering of the Syrian people. The regime's response to the early peaceful demonstrations in Syria was characterized by the use of excessive force, which only served to escalate tensions and fuel opposition sentiment. Despite this heavy-handed approach, the regime undertook contradictory measures in an attempt to manage the growing unrest. One such measure was the issuance of a presidential amnesty in March 2011, resulting in the release of approximately 260 prisoners, many of whom were Islamists or political opposition members. While some viewed this as an attempt to appease anti-government sentiment, others cite as a strategic move to manipulate the opposition by unleashing individuals labeled as jihadists or extremists. The regime's decision to release these prisoners raised questions about its motives and intentions. While some believed it was an effort to address growing discontent, others argued it was part of a broader strategy to quell the uprising through a combination of coercion and concessions. Similarly, the granting of Syrians 220,000 Kurds in April 2011 appeared to be a gesture of appeasement amid escalating tensions. However, the regime's labeling of the uprising as Islamist or extremist in nature aimed to rally support from sectarian communities, such as Alois and Christians, who were crucial to its survival. Despite abolishing the state of emergency in April 2011, the regime continued its repressive tactics, disregarding laws that did not serve its interests. The lack of accountability for crimes committed by security forces further highlighted the regime's disregard for the rule of law. While some argued that President Bashar al-Assad was not fully in control of the situation, others held him responsible as the supreme commander of the armed forces. The regime's reliance on the mukhabarat, or intelligence services, led to a disconnect between different branches of government, exacerbating the crisis. Overall, the regime's contradictory measures reflected its attempts to navigate the complex political landscape of the Syrian uprising. However, these efforts failed to address underlying grievances and ultimately contributed to the escalation of violence and unrest. The perception of Bashar al-Assad as a moderate personality open to democratic ideas, particularly influenced by his brief stay in Great Britain, was largely wishful thinking rather than reflective of reality. Despite initial hopes for reform under his leadership, Bashar al-Assad's regime quickly demonstrated its unwillingness to implement significant changes. The so-called Damascus Spring of political debate in 2000 was short-lived, suppressed by the regime's crackdown on dissenting voices. While Bashar al-Assad may have been exposed to Western values during his time in Great Britain, his adherence to the Syrian political system and his family's legacy overshadowed any influence from the West. He learned early on that success within the Syrian system required conformity to its norms and practices. Born and raised in Damascus, Bashar al-Assad was deeply rooted in the Syrian nationalist environment shaped by his father's presidency and the country's historical challenges and conflicts. His upbringing within the Syrian context, including experiences such as the Arab-Israeli conflict and the internal strife within Syria, molded his worldview and approach to governance. Despite his brief exposure to Western values, Bashar al-Assad's identity and political outlook were firmly rooted in his Syrian heritage and upbringing. His presidency was shaped more by his Syrian background and the legacy of his family's rule than any influence from the West. The Syrian Civil War saw a complex interplay of factors leading to escalating violence and conflict. Initially, peaceful demonstrations against the regime faced severe repression, triggering a cycle of violence. Social media played a crucial role in disseminating information globally, fueling indignation and counter-violence. While some armed anti-regime violence emerged, the early demonstrations predominantly maintained a non-violent character. However, the situation rapidly deteriorated, with radical Islamists seizing the opportunity presented by the Arab Spring to advance their agendas. The demonstrators initially sought freedom and peaceful reform but faced brutal suppression, pushing some to call for the regime's overthrow. Despite hopes for democratic change and Western support, the conflict escalated, fueled by external actors with strategic interests in the region. The opposition forces received military support from various countries, while the regime found backing from others, reflecting geopolitical rivalries and ambitions. The Syrian-Iranian alliance and the link between Syria and Hezbollah were driven by strategic interests rather than religious affiliations. Russia also intervened to prevent the emergence of an Islamist state in the region. During the Syrian war, there were speculations about whether Alois desired their own state or autonomous region in the event of the regime's fall, fearing large-scale revenge killings in a sectarian conflict. Some suggested providing assurances to Alois to prevent further polarization, but trust in such guarantees was questionable amid the ongoing sectarian war. Peter Harling and Robert Malley argued in 2011 that the Assad regime relied on a sectarian survival instinct, anticipating that Alawite troops would defend their villages fiercely. They suggested that after experiencing enough violence, many Alois would seek refuge in their mountainous regions, viewing them as safer than the capital. However, this perspective overlooks the attachment of many Alois born and raised in Damascus to the city as their home. President Bashar al-Assad, born in Damascus, may symbolize this divide, with traditions suggesting he might be buried in his father's birthplace despite his strong connection to Damascus. The conflict's sectarian nature is further complicated by the geographic intermingling of various ethnic and sectarian groups throughout Syria. Fabrice Balanchi suggested that evidence of potential Alawi separation could be found in transport infrastructure and military bases in the region, strategically vital for defending Alawi territories within Syria. However, territorial fragmentation of Syria is unlikely as most communities, including Alois, oppose it. The Syrian identity has prevailed despite decades of Arab nationalist indoctrination, with Western commentators cautious about advocating for the region's map redrawn. Historical documents, such as a purported petition for a separate Alawi state in 1936, are often used politically, but they do not necessarily reflect present-day views. A poll conducted in 2016 by the Day After Association revealed that Alois were among the strongest opponents of decentralization, fearing partition and the loss of control by the Alawi-dominated regime. Decentralization could also jeopardize the privileged positions of many Alois within the current system.